My fiancé wouldn't stop comparing me to his successful friend. So I followed her example all the way to a prenup. My name is Claire Bennett. I'm 32 years old, and until 3 weeks ago, I thought the biggest disagreement my fiancé and I would have before our wedding would be something trivial, like the seating chart or how many guests to invite. I couldn't have been more wrong. Ethan Carter and I had been together for 4 years and engaged for 6 months. We planned to marry the following spring, and despite earning very different salaries, money had never been a source of conflict. I worked in finance. Ethan was a marketing coordinator, and we split our expenses according to our incomes. I paid more because I earned more, and neither of us ever seemed to resent it. Our conversations were usually about saving for a bigger house after the wedding, not about keeping score. That changed the night Jessica bought her husband a brand new BMW X5. Jessica, one of Ethan's closest college friends, had built a successful consulting business, and she and her husband Mark invited us over to celebrate. Ethan barely made it inside before circling the SUV, asking Mark about the engine, the options, even how Jessica had planned the surprise. By the time we left, he'd taken photos of the dashboard to send his brother. I thought he was simply impressed. About 10 minutes into the drive home, he looked out the window and asked quietly, "Can I ask you something?" I laughed. That question usually gets us into trouble. I didn't laugh back. "Why can't you be more like Jessica?" For a moment, I thought I'd misheard him. "What?" "She bought Mark a BMW because she loves him. We're saving for a house," I reminded him. "So are lots of couples." Jessica also owns a very successful business. He shrugged. "Then work harder. Get promoted." I waited for him to smile. He never did. "I'm serious, Claire. A wife who really appreciates her husband doesn't mind spoiling him." The rest of the drive passed in silence. Until that night, I'd believed we were building a future together. Suddenly, it felt as though I was being measured against another woman without ever agreeing to the competition. I kept telling myself it had been one careless comment that would disappear by morning. Instead, it became the beginning of a comparison that followed me everywhere. Before long, Ethan was bringing her up in almost every conversation. Ethan admired the trips she planned, the gifts she bought Mark, and the fact that he never seemed to worry about money. None of those comments sounded particularly cruel on their own, but together they carried the same message. Whatever I did, someone else was doing it better. One evening, while I was paying our electric bill, Ethan glanced at my laptop and said, almost casually, "Jessica told me Mark hasn't had to think about bills in years." I looked up. "Good for Mark." He sighed. "You know exactly what I mean." Unfortunately, by then, I did. It wasn't that Ethan wanted nice things. So did I. What hurt was realizing I'd stopped being his partner and started being measured against another woman. With our wedding only 6 months away, I convinced myself it was just a phase. Then, the following Saturday, a conversation over coffee changed everything. Another couple mentioned they'd signed a prenup before getting married. "Best financial decision we ever made," the husband said. Ethan laughed. Planning for divorce before the wedding? I could never do that. His reaction stayed with me all evening. For 2 weeks, he'd insisted Jessica was the example I should follow, so I decided it was time to find out whether he actually knew the whole story. While Ethan was in the shower, I texted Mark. "Random question. Did you and Jessica sign a prenup?" His reply came almost immediately. "Yes, a detailed one. Her financial advisor recommended it before we got engaged. Why?" I hesitated for a second before answering. "Ethan keeps telling me I should be more like Jessica." 3 dots appeared. Then Mark replied. I had a feeling that's where this was headed. I smiled for the first time in days. Maybe it's time I finally took Ethan's advice. His last message was only one sentence. "Good luck, you're going to need it." Something told me he was right. The following evening, Ethan brought up the BMW again while we were eating dinner. He leaned back in his chair and said, almost casually, "I've been thinking, after we're married, maybe we should upgrade my car, something like a BMW." "You know what?" I said, setting down my fork. "I think you're right." His face lit up immediately. "I knew you'd come around." "I have," I replied. "If you really want me to be more like Jessica, then I should follow her example completely." He grinned, assuming he'd won the argument, until I added, "Before we get married, I'd like us to sign a prenup." The smile disappeared so quickly it was almost unsettling. "A prenup?" "Yes. Claire, that's not the same thing." "Why not?" "Because buying your husband a BMW isn't the same as asking him to sign legal papers." I met his eyes without raising my voice. "No, but Jessica did both." He stared at me. "How do you even know that?" I asked Mark. "You asked him about their marriage. You spent 2 weeks telling me Jessica was the perfect example of what a wife should be. I figured I deserved to know the whole story instead of just the parts you liked." He pushed his chair back with a scrape across the floor. That's different. Then explain how. He opened his mouth, closed it again, and finally muttered, "It just is." For the first time, I stopped thinking about the BMW. The car had never been the issue. Ethan wanted the lifestyle he imagined Jessica gave her husband, but the moment I mentioned the one decision she'd made to protect everything she'd built, suddenly none of the comparisons applied anymore. He let out a dry laugh and shook his head. "So this is because Jessica has a prenup?" "Not exactly," I said. "It's because you've spent the last 2 weeks insisting she's the woman I should become." "I meant successful, generous, thoughtful, and financially responsible," I added. I rubbed a hand across his face in frustration. "Claire, you know exactly what you're doing." "I do. I'm taking your advice seriously. A prenup tells me you don't trust me. It tells both of us exactly what we each owned before we met. That's very different." "So now we're keeping score." "No, we're recognizing reality." I gestured around the condo. "I bought this place before I knew you. I built my retirement accounts before we met, and you already had your student loans. A prenup doesn't change any of that. It simply makes sure neither of us pretends those things started after the wedding." He stood there in silence, his expression hardening until he finally grabbed his jacket. "I'm going to my mom's, if that's what you need." He stopped at the door and turned back. "You're really not going to stop me?" "I don't want you to leave," I admitted, "but I'm not going to beg you to stay just because we disagree." The door slammed behind him, leaving his untouched dinner on the table. Somehow that plate, already going cold, made the apartment feel emptier than the argument had. I left his dinner exactly where it was. By midnight, the food had gone cold, but neither of us came back to finish the conversation. The next morning, he never came home. Around 10, a text appeared on my phone. "We need space." I replied with a single word. "Okay." Nothing came back. 2 days later, I met Rachel Morgan, a family law attorney recommended by a colleague. After listening patiently to everything, from the BMW to Ethan's endless comparisons, she leaned back in her chair and summed it up in one sentence. "So he wants you to copy Jessica's generosity, but not the way she protects what she's built." I laughed quietly. "That's exactly it." Rachel nodded. "Then let's make sure your agreement is fair, not emotional." For the next 2 hours, we reviewed every asset and debt either of us already owned. She insisted Ethan should have his own attorney, that nothing should be rushed, and that every term had to be transparent. It wasn't about winning or punishing anyone. It was simply about drawing a clear line between the lives we'd built separately and the one we hoped to build together. The agreement was straightforward. Everything either of us owned before marriage remained ours, including my condo, retirement accounts, and investments, while anything we built together afterward could be divided fairly. It wasn't designed to leave Ethan with nothing. It simply protected what already existed. I left Rachel's office feeling calmer than I had in weeks. That feeling lasted until Friday evening. Ethan texted, "Dan, we please talk? I miss you." I invited him over. He arrived carrying takeout from our favorite Thai restaurant, the same peace offering he'd brought after the forgotten anniversaries and every argument he'd wanted to erase without really discussing it. For the first 20 minutes, we avoided the real issue, talking about work, difficult clients, and the TV show we'd been watching together, until he reached across the table and quietly said, "I hate this." "Me too." "I don't want us fighting." "Neither do I." For a moment, with his hand resting over mine, I almost believed we could go back to the way things had been. Then I remembered why he'd walked out. I got up, retrieved the large envelope from the kitchen counter, and placed it in front of him. His expression changed immediately. "What is that?" "The prenup." "You actually hired a lawyer?" "I told you I was serious." "You couldn't even wait until we talked again?" "We already had that conversation, Ethan. You left." He stared at the envelope without touching it. "I don't want to read it." "Then let your own attorney read it." "My attorney?" "Yes. Rachel insisted you should have independent legal advice." I let out a bitter laugh. "So you've already got lawyers involved?" "No," I said. "I got legal advice. There's a difference." He shook his head. "This is insane. It's standard. Not if you actually trust the person you're marrying." I met his eyes. Did Jessica stop trusting Mark when they signed theirs? His jaw tightened. "Stop bringing them into this." I couldn't help shaking my head. "I didn't. You spent 2 weeks telling me I should be more like Jessica. I'm simply following the example you gave me." I had no answer. After a long silence, he stood. "I need time." "Take all the time you need." He left without opening the envelope. 3 days later, he texted to say he'd hired an attorney after all. This time I wasn't heartbroken. I was exhausted. By the next morning, the pressure had shifted from Ethan to his family. His mother called first, followed by his sister, and then his best friend. I ignored every call, but the voicemails kept coming. Diane's message was the longest. Claire, I don't know what's gotten into you, but you need to fix this. Ethan loves you. He's given you 4 years of his life, and treating him like a financial risk is cruel. You're lucky my son still wants to marry you. Call me. I listened once, forwarded it to Rachel, and received a reply less than a minute later. Save every message. Don't argue with family members. I intended to follow that advice. Less than 24 hours later, my doorbell rang. When I opened it, Ethan was standing there with Diane and his older sister Vanessa, as though the three of them had decided this was no longer a conversation between two people preparing to get married. Diane walked straight into my condo before I had a chance to invite anyone inside. We need to discuss this prenup, she announced as if she owned the place. Apparently, Vanessa stayed near the door while Diane settled onto my couch and declared, "This document is completely unacceptable." "You've actually read it?" I asked. Ethan explained it. "That's not what I asked." The room fell quiet for a second before Vanessa stepped in. "Claire, you're turning this into something much bigger than it needs to be. Ethan's devastated. I'm not the one who showed up with backup." Diane leaned forward. "Marriage means sharing everything." "No," I replied, taking the chair opposite her. "Marriage means building something together. Those aren't the same thing." Vanessa folded her arms. "Then what exactly are you trying so hard to protect?" Instead of arguing, I answered with numbers. "My condo is worth about $320,000. My retirement accounts are around $180,000, and I have another $95,000 invested. That's nearly $600,000 I earned before Ethan and I ever planned a wedding." Diane gave a dismissive laugh. "You're acting like my son is after your money. I'm not. A prenup doesn't accuse anyone of anything. It simply says what belonged to each of us before marriage stays that way, unless we both decide otherwise." "So you don't trust him," Vanessa said. I looked at Ethan for the first time since they'd walked in. "Do you remember the BMW?" His jaw tightened. "Claire?" "No, let's finish this." I turned back to Diane and Vanessa. For 2 weeks, Ethan kept telling me I should be more like Jessica. She bought her husband a BMW, surprised him with expensive trips and gifts, and apparently that's what a good wife is supposed to do. Neither of them interrupted. So I asked Mark one simple question. I let the silence linger for a moment. Jessica also made him sign a prenup. The room went completely still. Diane looked at Ethan. Vanessa did the same. I continued before either of them could speak. Jessica protects everything she built before marriage, and Ethan never had a problem with that. So explain something to me. If she's still the perfect wife after buying a BMW and signing a prenup, why does doing exactly the same thing suddenly make me the villain? No one answered. Not because they disagreed, but because none of them could explain the contradiction anymore. They weren't upset that the prenup was unfair. They were upset because, for the first time, someone had pointed out the double standard they'd all been defending without ever saying it out loud. After they left, the condo felt strangely quiet. I wandered from room to room pretending to clean until I realized I'd wiped the same kitchen counter 3 times. My mind kept replaying Ethan's expression. He hadn't looked hurt. He'd looked cornered, like someone who had prepared for one argument only to discover the conversation had become something completely different. The next morning, Jessica called. "I heard what happened," she said before I could ask why she was calling. "Mark told me about your text and Ethan filled in the rest. So everyone knows." "I'm afraid so." She hesitated before adding, "I owe you an apology. Ethan mentioned a few times that he wished you'd be more like me. I honestly thought he was joking. If I'd realized he meant it, I would have shut it down immediately. It wasn't harmless." "I know." She took a slow breath. "And there's something else you should know. Mark and I didn't sign a prenup because we didn't trust each other. My parents insisted we speak to an attorney after my business took off, and by the end of those meetings we realized it protected both of us equally. So it was never one-sided. Not even close." "Then why didn't Ethan know that?" Jessica gave a quiet, almost embarrassed laugh. "He never asked." That answer stayed with me long after the call ended. Ethan had admired the finished result, but he'd never cared enough to understand how it had been built. The following afternoon he texted, "Dan, we meet, neutral place." We agreed on a coffee shop halfway between our apartments. When I arrived, Ethan was already waiting with a grey-haired attorney named Daniel Brooks. After introductions, Daniel opened a folder containing Rachel's draft. "I've reviewed the agreement," he said. "It's thorough, but my client has concerns." "What concerns?" I asked. "It strongly protects your premarital assets. It protects Ethan's too." Daniel nodded. "That's true. Ethan's concern is where he fits if the marriage doesn't last." Ethan finally spoke. "I just don't want to end up with nothing." I frowned. You keep everything you bring into the marriage. I keep everything I bring into it. Anything we build together is still ours to negotiate fairly. I leaned forward. But what if I spend years supporting your career or make sacrifices for our family? Then we discuss those years, I replied. That's exactly what a fair agreement is for. Daniel looked relieved, and for a moment I thought we were finally moving toward common ground. Then Ethan reached into his backpack and slid several handwritten pages across the table. I've been thinking about some compromises. I unfolded the papers. The first few lines sounded reasonable. The rest didn't. I wanted me to pay off his student loans before the wedding, remove the protection on my condo after 2 years of marriage, guarantee him a luxury SUV within our first year together, and include annual travel expenses in the agreement. Even if we divorced before 10 years, he wanted compensation calculated as though we'd already reached that milestone. I lowered the papers and looked at him. Ethan, these aren't compromises. They're just ideas. They're guarantees. I need to know I'll be secure. You already are. He shook his head. My income isn't like yours. I held his gaze. So marrying me has become a financial calculation. His expression changed immediately. That's not what I meant. Then tell me what you meant. He opened his mouth but couldn't find an answer. Even Daniel quietly closed his folder, sensing the meeting had reached the point where the problem was no longer the prenup itself. The meeting ended a few minutes later without either of us changing our position. Ethan left with Daniel, and I drove home wondering whether we'd just ended our engagement without ever saying the words. Every conversation with Ethan's family had ended with someone accusing me of valuing money more than love. Then I looked at Robert's message again. He hadn't asked me to save the engagement. He hadn't told me to forgive Ethan. He'd simply asked to talk. The next morning we met at Harper's Cafe. Robert looked exhausted, not because he'd aged overnight, but because he carried the expression of someone who'd spent years watching the same mistake repeat itself. I owe you an apology, he said after we sat down. For what? For letting this get this far. When I didn't interrupt, Robert continued. When Ethan was growing up, Diane compared him to everyone. Better grades, better athletes, better jobs. I kept telling myself it wasn't worth arguing about, but looking back, I think that's where all of this started. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup before continuing. Then social media did the rest. Ethan started comparing our real life to carefully edited versions of other people's lives, never seeing the debt, pressure, or sacrifices behind any of it. I've tried telling him that. I know, Robert said quietly. He just never heard you. I took a breath and started at the beginning. I walked him through the BMW, weeks of comparisons, the prenup, Rachel, the meeting with Daniel, and finally Ethan's list of demands. He listened without interrupting, then slowly shook his head. So my son spent weeks telling you to become more like Jessica, then got angry when you copied the one financial decision that actually protected everything she'd built. That's exactly what happened. I wish I could tell you he was making sense. So do I. I'm going to talk to him, Robert said. I don't think it'll change anything. Maybe not, but I should have started those conversations years ago. That evening, Ethan called. You talked to my dad? I did. What did you tell him? Your own choices did. He let out a frustrated breath. Now he thinks I'm being unreasonable. I didn't ask him to think anything. You turned him against me. No, Ethan, you did that yourself. His voice softened. I just wanted to know I'd always come first. You already did. Then prove it. How? Tear up the prenup. I closed my eyes. Every conversation eventually came back to the same demand. My answer is still no. You've changed. No, I replied. I've stopped apologizing for having boundaries. Han ended the call. The following afternoon, my receptionist called to say Ethan was waiting in the lobby. I almost told her to send him away, but with half my team working through quarter-end deadlines, I decided it would be better to end the conversation quickly. The moment he saw me, he walked over. My parents think I'm greedy. I never called you greedy. You didn't have to. My dad already did. Those were his conclusions. His frustration spilled over. You've turned everyone against me. I held his gaze. No, the truth did. Several employees had begun noticing the argument, and one of the security guards quietly moved closer. Ethan saw him too. His shoulders relaxed and the anger drained from his face. I don't want to lose you. I don't either, I admitted, but I can't fix this by pretending the problem doesn't exist. Then stop the prenup. I won't. There was nothing left to negotiate. He wasn't asking for compromise anymore. He wanted me to abandon the only boundary I'd refused to move. I left without another word. After he disappeared through the lobby doors, the security guard checked that I was all right before reminding me to call if Ethan returned. I thanked him and went back upstairs, convinced the worst was finally over. I was wrong. The next morning, the wedding venue emailed to say Ethan had contacted them 3 times trying to postpone the ceremony without my approval. Since every contract and deposit was under my name, they refused to make any changes and asked whether I wanted additional restrictions placed on the booking. I agreed immediately. The issue wasn't the wedding date. It was realizing that every time Ethan couldn't persuade me directly, he looked for another way around me. 2 nights later, I unlocked my condo and found him sitting inside with our wedding binder on the coffee table. His eyes were red from crying, and for a moment I almost believed things could still be repaired. "We need to figure this out," he said. "I agree." Relief spread across his face until I finished the sentence. "Then sign the prenup." The hope disappeared immediately. "It's the same agreement for both of us," I said, opening the draft. "Your assets remain yours. Mine remain mine. Everything we build together belongs to both of us. It doesn't feel equal because I own more." I couldn't deny it. After several long seconds, he finally said, "What if we compromise? I'll sign if you pay off my student loans first." I closed the agreement. "No, you didn't even think about it." "I've done nothing but think about it." "So you're really ending us over paperwork?" I shook my head. "No, we're ending because every solution you offer starts with me giving up something that's already mine." Rain began tapping against the windows, filling the silence between us. Ethan stood, picked up his jacket, and quietly said, "I don't even know who you are anymore." I'm finally someone who doesn't apologize for having boundaries. Ethan lingered in the doorway for a moment, as though he expected me to stop him. When I didn't, he walked out into the rain. After that, the silence between us was complete. The calls stopped, the late-night apologies disappeared, and for several days neither of us reached out. I thought the quiet would feel like relief, but it felt more like waiting for another storm. On the 5th day, Jessica called. "I hope I'm not bothering you." "Not at all." She hesitated before saying, "Mark told me what Ethan asked for during the meeting with his attorney. I honestly couldn't believe it." "Neither could I. I want to tell you something I've never shared outside my family." She paused before continuing. "Our prenup almost saved our marriage." I frowned. "How?" "We went through a difficult year," she explained. "Because our finances were already separate, neither of us was afraid the other would take everything. We could focus on fixing the relationship instead of protecting ourselves." "So neither of you ever felt trapped?" "Exactly. The prenup protected my company, protected Mark's investments, and removed money from every argument before it had the chance to poison our marriage." I leaned back in my chair, thinking about everything Ethan and I had been fighting over. Jessica smiled gently. "I wish Ethan understood that." "I think he does," she replied after a moment. "He just doesn't like what it means." Her words stayed with me long after we hung up. For the first time, I stopped seeing the prenup as a legal document. It was simply a boundary, and Ethan was the only one who refused to respect it. 2 days later, Robert invited me to dinner. Before we'd even opened the menus, he apologized. "I spoke to Ethan, and he thinks you're punishing him. Diane keeps telling him that if he gives in now, you'll control the marriage forever." I couldn't help shaking my head. "I've never tried to control him." "I know," Robert said. "The problem started long before you came along." He admitted he'd spent years watching Diane compare Ethan to everyone around him, believing that staying quiet would keep the peace. Instead, Ethan grew up measuring every relationship against someone else's success. She compares neighbors, friends, relatives, anyone she thinks is doing better. Eventually, Ethan stopped seeing people for who they were and only saw who seemed to be winning. The explanation didn't excuse his behavior, but it finally helped me understand where it came from. Robert looked at me sadly. "I don't think you're ending this over a prenup." "I'm not. I think you're ending it because my son keeps asking you to prove your love by giving something up." I nodded. "That's exactly it." He sighed. I wish he'd realized that before it was too late. 2 days later, the wedding venue emailed to remind me of the cancellation deadline. If I cancelled before the end of the week, we'd lose the deposits. If I waited, we'd owe the remaining balance. I stared at the screen for several minutes before picking up the phone. "I'd like to cancel our wedding." By the time the paperwork was complete, we'd lost just over $9,000. Losing the deposit stung. Calling the venue hurt even more because it made everything final. That evening, Ethan came to my condo. I looked exhausted. "I heard you cancelled everything." "I did." "So this is really over?" "You stopped talking to me." "I needed time." "So did I." His eyes drifted around the apartment, lingering on the empty shelves where our wedding folders had once been. "Our invitations?" "I cancelled them." "The honeymoon too?" "Everything." He lowered himself onto the couch and let out a slow breath. "I don't know how we got here." "I do." He looked up, waiting for an answer, and I gave him the one we'd both been avoiding for weeks. You spent so much time comparing me to Jessica that, eventually, you stopped seeing me for who I was. I said I was sorry. You apologized for hurting me, I replied. You never apologized for believing I should be someone else. He covered his face with both hands, his voice muffled. I don't want to lose you. I know, and I believe you when you say you'll never compare me to anyone again. For a moment, hope returned to his face, but it disappeared when I quietly continued. That isn't enough anymore. He frowned. What else do you want from me? I wanted a partner who cared more about the life we were building together than the things I'd already built before we met. He'd sat there without speaking for several seconds before finally admitting what had been driving him all along. I was scared. Scared of what? That I'd always be behind you. You earned more, owned more, and every time someone joked that I'd married up, I hated it. For the first time, I understood where his insecurity came from. But understanding didn't erase everything that had happened afterward. The request to pay off his student loans, the luxury SUV, the list of financial guarantees he'd written into the prenup. Those weren't moments of fear. They were decisions he'd made because of it. I looked down at his hands. I wish we'd talked like this weeks ago. So do I. He hesitated before asking the question I'd been expecting. Is there still a chance for us? I glanced around the apartment. The wedding plans were gone, the contracts had been cancelled, and my attorney was already closing the file. The future we'd spent 4 years planning no longer existed. I don't think we're trying to save the same relationship anymore. He closed his eyes and nodded slowly. I'm sorry, Claire. I know. This time I believed him completely. His apology was sincere, but it had arrived after too many choices neither of us could undo. At the door, he stopped with one hand on the handle. Do you think we'll ever speak again? I hope so, I answered. But I think that only happens after we've both become people who would never repeat this story. He gave a small nod, walked to his car, and drove away without looking back. I watched until his taillights disappeared from the parking lot. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't wondering whether our wedding could still be saved. I was wondering how many warning signs I'd ignored long before Jessica ever bought that BMW. The days that followed were quiet. No angry messages, no late-night apologies, no more attempts to negotiate. It felt less like we had broken up overnight and more like we had finally admitted a relationship that had been unraveling for months was over. The following Monday, Rachel called. I've got some good news. I could use that. Ethan's attorney contacted me. The prenup? No, the engagement ring. I almost laughed. Let me guess. They want him to keep it. They tried. I reminded them an engagement ring is generally considered a conditional gift. No wedding, no completed condition. 3 days later, Daniel Brooks confirmed Ethan would return it voluntarily. No lawsuit, no courtroom, no dramatic ending. Just another loose end quietly tied off. We met outside my condo that Thursday evening. Ethan stepped out of his car carrying a small black ring box. I figured mailing it would have felt wrong. It would have. He handed it to me without either of us opening it. The ring no longer mattered. It was simply the last unfinished piece of our engagement. My mom still thinks you're wrong, he admitted. I assumed she would. My dad doesn't. Honestly, this whole thing exposed problems between them too. That didn't surprise me. Before leaving, he asked one last question. Do you still have the prenup? I do. He nodded slowly. I finally read all of it. I waited. It wasn't unfair. Those 4 words meant more than any apology he'd given me. I should have read it before I got angry, he admitted. You should have. I thought signing it meant admitting I had less. It meant admitting we both had something worth protecting. The corner of his mouth lifted for only a second. I understand that now. I believed him. The problem was that belief had arrived too late to change anything. The following week, I changed the locks on my condo, not because I expected Ethan to come back, but because he still had a key. While the locksmith worked, he asked if I was moving. No, I replied. I'm just closing one chapter. A faint smile crossed his face. Best reason I've heard all week. That weekend, I packed away everything connected to the wedding. Guest lists, seating charts, invitations, and playlists all disappeared into storage boxes until I reached a handwritten page we'd filled out almost a year earlier. What matters most in our marriage? I'd written trust, respect, communication, and partnership. Ethan's list looked different. Family, loyalty, security, and adventure. I stared at one word. Security. Back then I thought we meant the same thing when we wrote security. We didn't. I was thinking about feeling safe with someone. Ethan was thinking about never falling behind. A week later, Jessica invited me to lunch. Mark joined us and eventually apologized for answering my text about their prenup. I thought you were just curious, he admitted. I never imagined it had become the center of everything. It wasn't, I said. Jessica looked surprised. No, I shook my head. That agreement was only a flashlight. It didn't create the problem. It simply showed me what had been there all along. Mark nodded slowly, while Jessica reached across the table and squeezed my hand. For what it's worth, I think you were incredibly brave. I smiled. I was terrified. Jessica squeezed my hand. Most brave decisions begin that way. Over the next month, friends inevitably started asking what had happened. Some had heard Ethan's version, some had heard mine, and most only knew fragments of the story. I stopped trying to explain the details and gave everyone the same answer. We wanted very different marriages. The people who genuinely cared accepted that. The ones looking for gossip quickly lost interest, and for the first time I realized I didn't need everyone to understand my decision. The only opinions that mattered belonged to the people who had actually watched everything unfold. About 6 weeks after we cancelled the wedding, my phone buzzed with a message from an unfamiliar number. I hope you're happy. A second message followed almost immediately. You chose money over us. I recognized Ethan's wording instantly. A month earlier, I would have written a long reply defending myself. Instead, I locked my phone and blocked the number. Not because I was angry, because I was finally at peace. Some conversations don't heal anything. They only reopen wounds that have already begun to close. The following weekend, Robert invited me for coffee one last time. Ethan started therapy, he said. I smiled. I'm glad. So am I. He wasn't thrilled when I suggested it, but I think he finally understands he can't keep measuring his life against everyone else's. After a pause, he looked at me and added, I also owe you thanks. You refused to pretend everything was fine, and that forced me to admit something I'd ignored for years. You mean Ethan? I mean myself. He stirred his coffee before continuing. I always thought keeping quiet avoided conflict. Now I realize silence can do just as much damage. Those words stayed with me. 3 months later, my condo finally felt like home again. The wedding plans were packed away, the ring had been sold to recover part of the deposits, and life slowly settled into ordinary routines. Work, friends, weekend hikes, and therapy every other Thursday. One afternoon, I found the photo Ethan had taken of Jessica's BMW. I stared at it for a moment before deleting it. The BMW never ended our engagement, and neither did the prenup. Cancelling the weddings hurt. Losing nearly $10,000 hurt. Watching 4 years disappear hurt even more. But none of it would have hurt as much as spending a lifetime with someone who believed my limits only mattered until they got in his way. Looking back, that wedding cost me $9,000. Marrying the wrong man would have cost me the rest of my life.